Today's discussion will be presented in two sections since we are recording this session for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session and we'll try to get them answered online. We are particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Jason Miller, Executive Editor for Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Let me turn over the reins to Jason to begin today's discussion.
Welcome to the discussion today, and thanks for joining us. Our guest is Randy Wood, the Regional Vice President for Federal Sales for F5 Networks. Randy, welcome to this program.
Jason, thanks for having me.
Today we're talking about cybersecurity, not just any type of cybersecurity. We're talking about where cybersecurity needs to go, and in some cases where it's heading, to the application and to the data. So let's get started. Security is changing, we know that, right? We see it every day. But it's not so much about the network, it's not so much about the device. What is it about? It's really about the perimeter, the data, right? So talk a little bit about what does it mean for the change in application in data security.
Sure, so I think a good place to start is at the perimeter, right? The perimeter that we know is a very structured, very rigid perimeter. That's the world we come from. And I think what we're seeing now is the new perimeter is much, much different. It's much more simple. It's based on two things. It's based on access, the user, and application. And it's not as rigid, right? It's all about the application. It's all about accessing that application and accessing that application independent of time and space and device, or even where that application lives. So a hybrid deployment, a cloud deployment, on-prem, that's how we define the new perimeter.
In many ways, this is something that's been happening with the move to mobility. But I remember back in mid-2000s, it was all about the data. That was a key term we heard many times.
Right.
The latest cybersecurity events that's happened, the OPM hack, for instance, really refocuses us on that data piece. Why is it now more about the data versus more about the hardware or the device?
Well, so it's really two things. It's data, to be sure, right? Because that's what we're after in so many ways. That's the crown jewels of federal organizations. But it's about that application, right? It's about gaining access to that application, be it malware or some advanced persistent threat or some other way of compromising a network and environment to get access to it, to begin to exfiltrate that data, right? To sit there undetected, undiscovered in a clandestine way, maybe exfiltrate some command and control information, gain access to that application such that I can get that data, right? But it shines a new focus on the importance of the application. I think we take that for granted in our day-to-day lives, but it's all about the application. What's more, it's about the application experience, right? And one critical component to application experience is security. How secure is your application?
And that's the key here, application experience, because if you have bad experiences, well, number one, you won't go back to that application. And when we talk about in the consumer world, but even in the federal world, you as the provider need to have that application be a good experience so the customer enjoys it. Talk a little bit about how that security model is changing, cloud mobility, how that all fits into that idea of application security.
Yeah, so it's this idea of structure is gone, right? There's no structure, there's no predictability. Users are accessing applications from all sorts of devices, from all times of the day, from all different places, right? So it's not what it used to be with respect to I have a data center, I have known points of access. It could be anytime, any place, and so I think the burden, the challenge it puts on IT managers, on security managers, is dramatically different than it was even 2 years ago. And the idea of mobility is compounding that problem quite dramatically.
Let's talk about that burden for a second, because I think understanding what systems administrators, IT security people have to do is part of how to solve the problem. So when you talk about burden, is because of that accessibility issue, because it has to go on your mobile device, on your tablet, on your laptop, or is there more to the burden because of how the security is done and how people potentially could get into the application?
Well, so I think it's probably both, right? It's the burden now. Well, first of all, there's an expectation, right? There's a end user expectation that I can have the same application experience, again, independent of time and space and the device that's in front of me. And I didn't have that expectation 2 years ago. And so the challenge of the burden on IT and security managers is to fulfill and deliver on that experience while maintaining a high degree of security, right? Maintaining that the application is secure and that the access to that application is secure in this new perimeter, right? In this new perimeter that we've not lived in, that we've not worked in, like we did in the traditional world that we've come from.
And the old perimeter, as you said, is really hard in the network. The routers, the switches, the servers, everything gets stopped there, and then the application can be free for all. In this is why you guys at F5 Networks really are talking about the zero trust model. Talk a little bit about what that means and how it works and how does it protect applications.
Yeah, so zero trust model is simply this. If you look at the hacks, the breaches, the infiltration, the data loss that's occurred, even just very recently, they all have one thing in common. And it occurred because some part of an organization, some users within an organization gave up some level of trust to a bad guy that enabled access to the data and to the application. And so the zero trust model is simply a model, it's a way of thinking, a way of architecting our environments, in that we don't trust anybody. We trust no application. We trust no user. We trust no connection. We trust no data flow initially without applying some sophisticated algorithms in cryptography and access control and authorization to get a better sense of who that user is and to better establish that trust. That is certainly to the confidentiality and integrity of the data, but also to access and authorization of that application. And so this is becoming sort of the new norm. We trust no one, we trust nothing.
It almost sounds like in many ways you're talking about a back-end attribute exchange, you're talking about identity management, you're kind of talking a lot of, when you talk about the zero trust model, do those pieces that the agencies have been doing over the last, feels like a decade now, fit into the zero trust model because you got to authenticate and verify and then you get access?
Well, they absolutely do, and so when you deal in the federal world, sometimes you deal with a superset of things, right, based on how the federal government does business. So we have to pay attention to a lot of things that you don't pay attention to in the commercial world. Here's what I'll tell you. The zero trust model applies not just to the application, but to that data confidentiality, to that data integrity, and so advancements in cryptography, for example, make it such that I'm not just protecting my data transit for my high value assets, but for all communications. Right? SSL everywhere is a great example of that type of thinking. That is not something that we've traditionally done, that the federal government's traditionally done, and it is an emerging trend now in IT and security infrastructures.
When you're talking about implementing the zero trust model, what does that include? What does that mean for an agency?
So it means that I trust no application, I trust no user, I trust no data at rest, I trust no data at flow.
Right, but when you talk about you trust, that means everything's got to be verified. Everything. So if you, as Randy Wood, wants to go into your agency X and pull back some data to do your job for the day, you have to authenticate yourself. You have to verify yourself. So to implement something like a zero trust model, I already have my PIV card, right? My HSPD 12 card. Isn't that good enough? Well, no, obviously, because what you're saying is there's so many other pieces to it.
Well, but there's ways to simplify that. So, part of the zero trust model is, and I suppose is an increase in the burden, a dramatic increase in the burden on IT and security staffs. The role of a company like F5, frankly, is to dramatically abstract that complexity, such that I take advantage of things like federation for authorization and authentication with a CAC or PIV card, so that what's exposed to the user is back to an outstanding application experience, where all this really heavy stuff is done on the back end, but none of that's exposed to the user, right? So I really abstract that out of it, but I get a better, what results is a better security posture throughout the environment.
So in many ways, when you get the better the better experience, high availability, high performance, I want to talk about that in a sec. But when you guys go into an agency and start working with a client around the zero trust model, what kind of advice are you giving them? What are you telling them where to start?
Yeah, so
it's not one thing, right? It's not a software, right?
No, I think it's the I think it's the obvious things. Data encryption, right? Let's encrypt as much of our traffic as we can. It makes sense. SSL encryption has improved dramatically based on where we came from even 2 years ago. That's both in performance and in the cipher and cryptography itself, right? So it's an easier thing to do. It's better understood, better design guides. That's for both inbound traffic, which is a pretty obvious thing that we've traditionally done, as well as outbound traffic, right? Let's encrypt our outbound traffic, and let's do one more thing, Jason. As we're establishing these SSL connections at certain points in our network where it approaches the application or leaves the application to the user, let's do SSL inspection. Let's decrypt that. Let's look into that. Let's maybe take it off to an IDS or an IPS or a FireEye, for example, have a look at that traffic and make sure it is what we think it is and the users are who they say they are. That's both on an inbound and an outbound connection. That's a great place to start.
And many times the data encryption piece, while there's memos and rules and requirements and policies, that is, it becomes difficult to do. Is that the piece that when you talk to your clients that they just are head scratching because, okay, we know we should do it, but we're so worried it's going to break this application or make this service not as convenient or flexible? Do you hear that a lot?
We hear that a lot. Turns out that's the business we're in. That's what we do. So I think we give good advice there, and we are instantly relevant in that conversation. But it's not. It's estimated that 30% of the world's web servers are SSL enabled now. That figure's growing 20% a year, and we know that the bad guys on the internet are trying to maintain a level of anonymity and inability to be tracked. And they're increasingly doing this through SSL type connections, right? So the very things we're using to protect ourselves, to protect the confidentiality and integrity of our data, bad guys are taking advantage of. So a break and inspect, SSL inspect capability, inbound and outbound, sort of overcomes that.
It's interesting because when you talk about the idea of cyber and the growth of SSL encryption, one of the things that has come up is the Office of Management and Budget called for a 30-day cyber sprint just recently, and one big part of that is encrypting data at rest and data in transit. Now, they don't call it SSL enabled, but what else is there, right?
That's what it is.
They're not going to call it, yeah. So when an agency starts down that path, kind of a little bit of a curveball here, 30 days, is that really enough to get your SSL encrypted, your data encrypted?
Absolutely not. 30 days. 30 days might be enough to say, "Hey, I got a real problem here."
Yeah.
I think they say there's two types of users in the world. There's the types of users that have been hacked and
know it,
and the 30% that don't know it or won't admit it, right? Or the rest that don't know it or won't admit it.
That have been hacked and don't know it,
right?
Yeah.
And so 30 days isn't enough to do anything other than to go in and look and see. And I think it gets to what are the low-hanging fruit opportunities, and data in transit's a real opportunity. This idea of break and inspect is really, really important, and it's trending really big across our customer base right now.
Can you guys do the break and inspect?
Absolutely.
And then what happens? Like what are the results from that kind of analysis? Do people say, oh, look, your data's encrypted, you're safe, or quote unquote, or oh, you have a problem and here's the problem? Give me a sense of what people would get from that.
So what we do is not to be overly technical, but we're a full proxy architecture, right? Which means we will take a connection and we'll terminate it. And we'll take an SSL connection, we'll terminate it, we'll decrypt that connection, so now it's text in the clear, it's data in the clear. We can do one of several things, one of which would be take it off to an IDS or an IPS system or a FireEye for further analysis, right? Clone the connection, reestablish, re-encrypt, and off we go. Or we could do it inline to say, hey, we're not going to do anything until we validate this traffic is what we think it is or what it says it is. That's both on the inbound side and on the outbound side. So you kind of think of it like the U.S. Postal System and their X-ray capability, right? Well, they're not going to deliver a package that they don't know what it is or they haven't had a look at it. And it's really the same idea here. What's important, though, is cryptography management. So the crypto is really important, and no compromise in performance. So these are purpose-built devices. We call them application delivery controllers that do SSL offload that make that possible.
And I think that's key. I think don't compromise and don't hurt your performance, because I think many times security gets that bad rap. Well, if we do this security thing, then we can't do this other thing that's mission critical.
That's right.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, Randy, we're going to talk a little bit more and we get into some more details about this idea of SSL encryption, this idea of security at the application layer. You're listening to the discussion, Application Security Imperatives. Where is the new perimeter? Sponsored by F5 Networks on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.